If you have a look at the language of the UK versus the language of, say, the US, because we're often compared, the US has had a very overt language against Black people, and so they can't deny that racism exists. In the UK, for some reason, and because of the nature and the attitude, the UK has denied that they had slaves, and they had slavery in the UK. They've denied that racism exists there, and racism is very clearly there. And because often what happens in the UK is that things are carried out in a very subtle way, it's not overt. So that if you are in, for instance, if you're in employment and you are overlooked for promotion 3 or 4 times running, however, you are the person who's training. And I know of cases where people have challenged their employers and they've said, this feels like racism. And the employer has said, no, it's not racism, it's just not your time yet. Yeah. So the language is very subtle. Yeah. And so there are many cases where it's actually really hard to prove that racism exists. And they can choose to say it doesn't exist. And it would not serve them to say it does exist. Why would they stand up and say, yes, we're part of a very racist society? No, because the image that they want to, of course, racism exists. And, I have chosen, I suppose, not to give too much energy to what's been happening with the royal family, because I think there are so many more things happening to African people that we need to focus on. And I'm not going to give my time and energy to a group of privileged people who live off the taxpayers' money of the UK. I won't do that. These countries are all supposedly independent, but we also know that between trade, different trade agreements, different business agreements, and let me just go off on a tangent here and say Africa is not poor, the Caribbean is not poor. A lot of the world depends on those natural resources from the Caribbean and from a lot of the African countries. So the poverty is not there in terms of the resources. The poverty is there in terms of the mentality. And so when leaders sign trade agreements, when they enter into loan agreements from the large loan sharks, as I would call them, when you do this, you also sign the contract with is not favorable towards your own. Often you will not speak up because that contract, which has given you, the lucrative contract, which might be paying for your children's school fees overseas, or it might be paying for the lifestyle that you have, it might be paying for the yacht that you own. Yeah. When you have signed that contract and somebody comes out and abuses your people or burns down a hostel that they're living in, or sometimes we're talking about what's happening financially for them. What are the benefits that they're gaining from the contracts with these countries that are abusing their people that mean that they will not speak up? So for me, it's not a straightforward question about good leadership versus bad leadership. And I know other colleagues of mine would beg to differ. But I know that we compromise. And every year when a country tells me they're celebrating their independence, I look up and I say, okay, how independent are we? How independent is Ghana or Nigeria or Jamaica or Kenya or Tanzania? How independent are we? Because if we have money that ties us up, if we have loans that we have taken out to pay for our education or our healthcare system, if we're standing in a place where we cannot make hard decisions without asking somebody else for permission, and then that same individual is abusing our people overseas, our individual leaders, most of them have signed contracts. And that's a physical contract and a spiritual contract. Yes. And that contract doesn't protect the majority of their people. Yeah. And so individually, Individually, we can take responsibility for our lives, our bodies in the best way that we can. Yeah, so we can do a limited amount individually. But if we're talking about leadership, and that's what I think you are talking about, then the leaders need to have a look at what their priorities are. And if your priority is not the majority of the people in your country, if your priority is not about changing their lives for the better, then the contracts that you sign will also reflect that. Yeah, you will sign a contract. So many of our African countries, when we look at the statistics, the minimum wage is ridiculous. And so parents will choose whether they send their children out to work to sell their small wares rather than educate them, because that might be a choice that they have to make, an individual choice as a family. If a government makes a decision about who, but there's a limited choices that individuals have, and if you are poor, those choices are reduced drastically. If the government signs contracts about education, healthcare that affect people negatively, then they're making a decision there. And coming back to my question about how independent are we, or how independent do we want to be?
It's a good question. How independent do we really want to be? But I really do believe that we want to be fully independent. Only that sometimes, and maybe we don't know how costly it is to be free, because we don't have a cost. Uh, yeah, say something. Go.
Yes, freedom does have a cost. You're right, freedom does have a cost. And although some of us say we want it, we don't know what we would do if we had it. So it's about saying to, as I said, for me, it's about saying to our leaders, our political leaders, what does independence really mean for our countries, and how do we make that change the lives of the majority, the people who vote you in? How do you change their lives? How do you improve it?